recording and get underway. Well, let's get started, everyone. Greetings to everyone who is joining us. Welcome to the second in our 2020-2021 webinar series. I am Michael Woods, Associate Professor of History at the University of Tennessee and Director of the Papers of Andrew Jackson. I'm delighted you've joined us today, and please keep an eye out for our two upcoming webinars scheduled for March 24th and April 21st. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to offer sincere thanks to all those who made this event possible. Thanks to my colleagues, Mary Beckley and John Saval for technical assistance, and to the University of Tennessee History Department, especially Department Head Ernest Freeberg, for generous institutional and financial support. I'd also like to thank the agencies that keep the Jackson Papers afloat: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, the Watson Brown Foundation, and the Tennessee Historical Commission. Finally, many thanks to the members of the Jackson Papers Advisory Board for their assistance in organizing this series: Mark Cheatham, Emily Conroy Krutz, Lori Glover, Gautam Rao, Julie Reed, and Kay Wright Lewis. It's now my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Laura Ellen Smith. Dr. Smith earned her BA at the University of Leicester, her MA from University College London, and her first PhD from the University of Mississippi, where she wrote a dissertation on populism and democratization in the 1832 presidential election. I emphasize first PhD because Dr. Smith is now at work on a second at the University of Oxford, where she's currently writing a dissertation on the history of the imperial presidency in the United States. Additionally, Dr. Smith teaches American race relations and politics at Canterbury Christ Church University and at Richmond, the American International University in London. Dr. Smith is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles, which have appeared in such journals as American 19th Century History, the Journal of Mississippi History, White House Studies, and the Journal of Illinois History. She also regularly writes for popular venues, including the Washington Post. Today, Dr. Smith will give a presentation entitled Anti-Jacksonian Democratization, the First National Political Party Conventions. Attendees can use the Q&A feature to submit questions at any time, but we will field all questions toward the end of our hour-long webinar. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and now I will turn things over to Dr. Laura Ellen Smith.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It truly is an honor. And I wish I could be there in person. Don't we all miss the days of travel? I was actually reminiscing the last time that I presented on this particular topic. I was actually at LSU in beautiful Louisiana. It was a warm April pre-COVID. And yeah, don't we all miss those days? And unfortunately, here I am in my attic in London, trapped as it were. And it's been a very rainy, typical London day. But there we are, hopes for better days ahead. Of course, being virtual, the benefits are that hopefully it gives people more access to join the event. So it's democratizing in its way. And that is, of course, what we're focused on this evening. And now I must apologize, I don't have slides. I'm very sorry about that. The truth of the matter is, some of the most consistent feedback I've ever gotten from my work is that, Laura, that's great, but the pictures don't add anything. Cut the pictures. So I don't have any slides, no pictures, but I hope to make up for it with my passion on the topic. And like Michael said, please do submit your questions for the Q&A. I really want to make this as engaging as possible. So please do submit the questions anytime, and I really look forward to leaving time to discuss at the end. So without further ado, my talk, like Michael said, is on anti-Jacksonian democratization, the first actual political party conventions. And I thought I'd start just by providing some context. This is obviously an election that not a lot of people know much about, and that's something that I'm gonna get into. So let's just go back to an election that people do know about, 1828. That election obviously brought Jackson to the presidency and is equally renowned for his inauguration in 1829, March of 1829, of course. When Jackson ordered the White House open to the public on his inauguration day, His supporters interpreted it as a symbol of a more democratic America. Margaret Bayard Smith, a Washington socialite, witnessed Jackson's inauguration accompanied by Francis Scott Key, and encapsulated the event as, quote, "It is beautiful, it is sublime," a sentiment shared by Key. However, in contrast, when a disorderly horde of people inundated the White House, others, like Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, described the moment as the start of, quote, "the reign of King Maud." These divergent portrayals of Jackson are evident in historians' descriptions of him as either the first president whose actions were driven by his concern for the common man, or the skillful politician who utilized rhetoric and symbolism to simply depict himself as the harbinger of a more democratic America with a more participatory political system. And while historians increasingly portray Jackson as the latter, an understanding of Jackson is incomplete without an understanding of 1832, a campaign defined by Jackson's actions during his first term, which I'm going to get into a little bit. And I'd love to discuss more as well. Obviously, this is very much focused on the conventions. My talk will be the second half of it, but I'm more than happy to answer questions about 1832 and Jackson's time in office in general. So to win re-election, President Jackson relied on his populist appeal, yet shaped this appeal according to the actions he had taken as president, actions that had expanded his executive power. As in 1828, Jacksonians utilized populist rhetoric to depict him as a champion of the common man. The challenge for Jacksonians in 1832 was to consistently defend Jackson's populist appeal despite his current elite position and political status as president. Jackson presented his presidential actions taken during his first term, such as his veto to recharter the Second Bank of the United States, so-called BUS, as a populist action in defense of the working class. Nonetheless, as president, he also expanded his executive authority in what we could argue are anti-democratic ways, and I'm particularly thinking of his refusal to enforce the Supreme Court ruling in favor of the Cherokee sovereignty, which was an issue that you could talk about more with 1832, an issue that certainly deserves more attention, both from the standpoint of its impact on Indian removal and its standpoint on the election and the power of the presidency. Within the context of President Jackson's actions, Democrats were challenged in their defense of him and the various controversies that had mired his first presidential term. How Jackson portrayed himself and his actions in successfully being re-elected deepens our understanding of his ability to rise above controversy and demonstrate the ability of an incumbent to retain his populist appeal while simultaneously expanding his own authority in defense of supposedly populist actions. Although populism and democratization are often associated with each other, scholars of populism persuasively demonstrate how populism has been used to attain and retain power while simultaneously not increasing democratization. Jackson's presidency arguably demonstrates this strand of populism. In contrast, democratization can be defined as the increased engagement of citizens in political activities, like national conventions, of course. Some of the activities associated with democratization, such as voter turnout, for instance, are more tangible and quantifiable than others. For example, the variety of ways, including prints and speeches, which demonstrate involvement in campaigning. In comparison to Jackson's election as president in 1828, his re-election in 1832 has been overshadowed in the historiography of the so-called Age of Jackson. While two monographs have focused on the election of 1828 and its influence in American political history, in fact, no monograph currently, I emphasize currently, exists solely on the election of 1832. Now, the reason I emphasize currently is simply because there is one, and I repeat one, very pithy small book, and you can't really even call it a book, it is a monograph on the 1832 election that was written in the 1920s as part of it was a PhD dissertation. It's not even a published book. And being written in the 1920s, it is not in any way recognizable to the current historiographical standards and methodological research that we hold ourselves to today. So there really isn't any literature, current, respectable literature on the 1832 election in book form, in substantive, form. So this gap in historiography, as Donald B. Cole, a preeminent historian of Jackson, of course, has asserted, quote, "It's unfortunate for Jackson's re-election left an indelible mark on the history of the presidency." And I seek to address the silence. To a great extent, there has been little scholarly attention paid to the election of 1832 because historians have often assumed the similarities to the election of 1828. And I cast my mind back to my original beginning of my PhD research and discussions with my advisor saying, okay, well, you have to demonstrate the significance of 1832. What is the significance of 1832? And she said, you know, in my survey classes, I don't talk about 1832. I talk about 1824, maybe 1828, 1840, but I skip 1832, and a lot of people do. But I did meet her measure. I met her challenge. And so I hope, if nothing else, that you take away from this, that maybe if you do teach survey classes, that 1832 will get a mention. Hopefully I convince you. So, namely, historians have noted in both elections, 1828 and 1832, the growing importance of the burgeoning Democratic Party in contributing to Jackson's success and the diminishing prospects of the floundering National Republican Party, represented in 1828 by, of course, President John Quincy Adams, and 1832 by Henry Clay. Now, the policies of both Adams and Clay supported an increase in the scope of the federal government, whereas in both elections, Jackson relied on his appeal to the common man. It's important to recognize, however, three distinct differences between these two elections that make 1832 especially a worthy subject of study. So first, in contrast to 1828, in 1832, Jackson approached the election as president and thereby possessed an elite insider political status. And as has been much studied, in 1828, Jackson relied on a populist message and attacked President Quincy Adams and Secretary of State Clay for a supposed corrupt bargain that he argued had caused him to lose the contested election of 1824, which is, of course, an easy claim to make for Jackson as an outsider. However, in 1832, President Jackson had the challenge of retaining his populist appeal from an elite position of power. He achieved this by attacking the so-called money power embodied by the bus, which he associated with his opponent Clay. By analyzing the concept of Jackson as an elite politician, as emphasized by his political rivals, of course, my work contributes to the historiographical debate over the extent to which Jackson embodied the spirit of the common man. In his biography of Jackson, Sean Willits argues that, quote, "The bank veto captured the voters' loyalties, with Jackson emerging as an intrepid defender of the common man against privileged interests." And similarly, in the context of discussing the bank veto, Harry L. Watson gives a generalized description of how, quote, "One administration paper put it, the Jackson cause is the cause of democracy and the people against a corrupt and abandoned aristocracy." And thousands of Jackson voters accepted this analysis at face value. Now, in contrast to this, Cole analyzes Jackson's 1832 veto of the bus in a more detailed manner, observing that while it is often associated with his appeal to the common man, this understanding does not reflect the complete veto message, which simultaneously challenged the constitutionality of the bus. Despite having shown restraint in the language of his veto, Cole argues during the campaign and throughout the bank war following his re-election, Jackson powerfully utilized populist rhetoric to gain public support, and in so doing, depicted himself as the champion of the common man against the corrupt elite. By analyzing the portrayal of Jackson by contemporary newspapers, I made the case that Jackson successfully retained his populist appeal despite his elite political status and growth of executive power during his first term. Specifically, the rhetoric utilized by Jacksonian newspapers in appealing directly to the people, coupled with Jackson's own justification for vetoing the bill to recharter the bus in his veto message, presents especially compelling evidence of Jackson's ability to cloak an expansive reinterpretation of executive power with the populist appeal. Indeed, during his first term, executive actions, including other controversial vetoes, like, for example, the Maysville Road veto of 1830, were frequently justified as protecting the common man from any expansion of the federal government. The irony, of course, is that Jackson's actions themselves constituted a growth of executive power. Historian Stephen Campbell succinctly argues that Jackson's vetoes of both the Maysville Road and the bus are demonstrative of his, quote, fundamentally new assumption of presidential powers. You can see how I link my first dissertation interest in the 1832 election to my current research on presidential power and presidential precedent. Anyway, Jackson interpreted the veto power as his to wield at liberty, as he was the sole public servant elected by the country. That's his reinterpretation of executive power. That's what he brings to the office. This is the precedent that he creates. Jackson's actions during his first term played a vital role in impacting the political parties and the policies they focused on to challenge Jackson in 1832. Second, why is 1832 different from 1828? In contrast to the overwhelming focus on character in 1828, 1832 revolved around controversial policy issues, including concerns over the national bank, nullification, and internal improvements. These issues would have deep ramifications in the antebellum era. It is vital to recognize that the actions that Jackson took during his first term provided the context for his re-election campaign. By analyzing the issues focused on by newspapers, the political rhetoric employed during the campaign, my research advances the claim that Jackson's acts as president created a very different context for his re-election than the one that surrounded his ascendancy in 1828. Third, and finally, in comparison to 1828, in 1832, there were significant anti-Jacksonian third-party forces that encouraged democratization through the growth of opportunities for political participation. And this helped frame the national political debate. As opposed to a narrative in which Jackson was the force behind increasing democratization of white men in antebellum America, a closer examination of 1832 reveals that a third party was significant in this regard, with more citizens actively engaging in the campaign and increasing membership in a spectrum of political parties. So in 1832, anti-Masons presented voters with new opportunities to engage with national political issues at the grassroots level. And the political following of the anti-Masons is apparent in William Preston Vaughan's description of the impact of the anti-Masons as, quote, the near total destruction of the Masonic order in Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Ohio, all of these being at the heart of the anti-Masonic movement. And just a note on Vaughan, he is really, I mean, it's an older book, 1970s, but he is really the only sort of monograph on the anti-Masons. There's a little bit you can find in, for example, Formazano's work, but it's really, there's not a lot out there on the anti-Masons. So, the heart of the anti-Masonic movement, it is regional, but it's also depicting something much deeper going on in the American political psyche, if you will, at the time. Because also at the heart of the movement was this concern about the possible existence of a vast conspiracy that threatened American democracy, hence the party's embrace of increasing political activism and broadening political participation. Now, I can understand not many of you not being very familiar with the anti-Masons, so if you'll indulge me with just a little bit of context on the anti-Masons, it's quirky to say the least, but the party was founded as a result of a protest against the abduction and presumed murder of William Morgan in New York State in 1826. Morgan was a disillusioned Mason and floundering publisher, and he had declared his intention to publish the secrets of the society. After numerous threats failed to dissuade him from doing so, Masons gained the support of the local sheriff in imprisoning Morgan and thereafter abducting him. This sensational mystery stoked the flames of anti-Masonry, and the movement gained increasing support. For anti-Masons, Morgan's disappearance was solid proof that a dangerous network of men connected by a secret society were able to corrupt and direct the justice system and threaten the egalitarian concept of equal opportunity. This conspiratorial fear was fed by anxiety over the number of powerful men who were or had in their past been members of Masonic lodges. Jackson's election to the presidency in 1828 symbolized another Mason rising to a position of power. Analysis of the first national political nominating conventions demonstrate how the anti-Masonic party was especially significant in increasing democratization alongside a rise in political activism in 1832. So overall, the election of 1832 was significant in its own right. This is the end of my contextual spiel. It demonstrates that, I hope you're convinced, that Jackson's ability to maintain his appeal as a populist candidate despite his insider status also reveals how anti-Jacksonians, such as the anti-Masons, encourage further democratization by providing new opportunities for grassroots political participation. And one of the most unique features of the election is that it created the precedent of these national political party conventions. In the year leading up to the election, the Anti-Masonic Party, National Republican Party, and the Democrats consecutively held conventions for the first time, all meeting in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, historians have generally attributed the innovation of conventions to the Democrats. For example, Cole has downplayed the significance of the anti-Masons, instead crediting the Democratic Party with the creation of national conventions. But Cole's claim lacks this in-depth analysis of the conventions I hope to provide. This analysis will demonstrate that the anti-Masons ought to be recognized for providing the genesis of national political conventions. I argue that the anti-Masons and National Republicans were more influential than the Democrats in creating these conventions. In arguing that anti-Jacksonian democratization is apparent through the conventions of both the anti-Masons and National Republicans, I emphasize two fundamental aspects of the convention. Firstly, that the precedent set by the Anti-Masonic Party was significant in pressuring the National Republicans and the Democrats to hold their own conventions. Secondly, that the lack of democratization was evident in the Democratic Party convention, which only acted to nominate Martin Van Buren, preordained by the way, only acted to nominate Martin Van Buren as President Jackson's vice presidential running mate, rather than allowing any party members to voice their dissent from the current administration. So I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to go to each one. Anti-Masons, National Republicans, and Democrats, which is the order in which the conventions occurred. It's chronological. Historians gotta love that. And then I'll just do a short conclusion. So the anti-Masons, they were innovative. So what I argue, they're innovative in forcing an increase in both political activism and participation, being the first party to hold a national convention, setting the standard for the two other major parties to follow. In 1830, the anti-Masons held a convention in Philadelphia, at a time when Pennsylvania was second to New York in its number of anti-Masonic newspapers. For this convention, the anti-Masons invited the same number of delegates as the combined number of senators and congressmen each state possessed. And this would be aware that the fact that it's unprecedented, the fact that these national conventions has never happened before, they would have wanted the proceedings to have been recognizable and in keeping with democratic practices of the federal government. And this was acknowledged at the time by newspapers like the Freeman's Banner that explained how at the Baltimore Convention, Wirt's nomination, William Wirt, quote, must we suppose be called the anti-Masonic nomination because it was made by a body of delegates chosen by the anti-Masonic Party. The clearest evidence of the convention having encouraged political activism and participation is the support of the practice of national political nominating conventions by newspapers. September 26, 1831, Anti-Masonic Convention began in Baltimore. Delegates from 13 northern states attended, representing the grassroots base of support. Regardless of its lack of explicit endorsement of the Anti-Masonic Party, the Baltimore Patriot and Mercantile Advertiser, the newspaper, supports the first national political convention as evidence of expansion of political participation. The newspaper uses terms such as entirely at liberty and equally free to describe the convention. The editor intoned, every man who can appreciate an open and honorable course in politics must, it seems to me, understand this proceeding as a full exemplification of that principle. Feeling shunned by the hierarchical structure of the two major parties, in 1831, the anti-Masons felt compelled to offer their own candidate for the presidency. In his case study, The Emergence of Presidential Nominated Conventions from 1789 to 1832, James Chase describes the opportunity of the Anti-Masonic Baltimore Convention, which it gave for broadening political participation, as bewildering to party leaders. The ability of the grassroots party members to choose their own presidential candidate is portrayed by Chase as a revelation to the majority of anti-Masons who, quote, assumed that the choice would be made long before the Baltimore Convention. But the flaw in Chase's description of the anti-Masons as being surprised at the influence of wider political participation, evident in the nomination of Wirt, surprise nomination of Wirt, is that it disregards the long-term pressure for more transparency in the process through which political parties nominated their presidential candidates. The splintering of the anti-Masons away from the National Republicans and Clay's refusal as the National Republican presidential candidate to display any sympathy for anti-Masonic sentiments deprived him of crucial support. Now, some politicians at the time found this confounding, considering that, quote, at heart, anti-Masons are National Republicans. And perhaps the greatest irony of the 1832 election is the fact that regardless of the anti-Masonic party's unprecedented proffering of a presidential candidate, their own candidate and the candidate of the two main political parties were all Masons. And this emphasizes the strength of the anti-Masonic grassroots activism over its ideological coherence that led to the first National Convention. So the final thing I'll say about the Anti-Masonic Convention in and of itself is that in 1832, the significance of the Anti-Masonic Party was not in the strength or even the consistency of its anti-elitist aim to destroy the Masonic order. Indeed, the Freeman's Banner reprinted an article from the National Intelligencer, a newspaper that supported Clay, which described how, quote, Mr. Clay entertains views on this subject, anti-Masonry, in no respect differing from those of Mr. Wirt. So instead, the anti-Masonic Party's significance was in the precedent that it set by holding the first National Political Convention to nominate a presidential candidate, and the pressure that created on the two major parties to follow suit and accept this increase in transparency. Conventions allow for transparency by providing an open forum for speeches, debates, and nominations to be made in front of a public audience. So I'm next going to move to the National Republicans. The Anti-Masonic Convention and its nomination of Wirt presented a dilemma for the National Republicans. The anti-Masonic perspective was that their nomination of Wirt would force the National Republicans to unite with them to challenge President Jackson. Indeed, this was the singular reason Wirt had been persuaded to accept the anti-Masonic nomination in the first place, instead of attending the National Republican Convention to support Clay as he had planned to do. Shortly after accepting the anti-Masonic nomination, Wirt deeply regretted his decision to the extent that for 5 months following his nomination, Wirt tried without success to rescind his acceptance. The Freeman's Banner demonstrated disbelief that Wirt would oppose Clay in any way, stating Wirt was, quote, a personal political friend of Henry Clay, will not, when the trial should come, permit his name to be used against him. Mr. Wirt has been bred in better habits. The central error of the anti-Masons was how they underestimated Clay's potency as the leader of the opposition to Jackson. Perhaps the greatest difference between the anti-Masonic and National Republican conventions was whereas the nomination of Wirt came as a surprise, Clay's nomination was highly anticipated. Demonstrating its support of Clay, the Freeman's Banner described him as, quote, the center of the 24 stars of the Union. He will be supported by National Republicans at every quarter. The comparison between the grassroots action of the anti-Masons and the more rigid hierarchy of political leadership of the National Republicans represents an important distinction between the two differing forms of anti-Jacksonian political activism. Excuse me. The advent of the National Republican Convention provides the strongest evidence of anti-Jacksonian political activism occurring and influencing the party. The National Republican Convention began on December 12, 1831. Delegates arrived from 18 states, with the winter weather impacting attendance. Louisiana, the sole state delegation for the Deep South, indicated the strength of Southern Jacksonianism. Clay commented in a private letter on the urge that this party's presidential nomination will be a popular measure and not one of caucus agency. And this sentiment directly contradicts Holt's portrayal of the National Republicans as representing an outmoded form of politics that did not recognize the pressure for broadening political participation that the anti-Masons were responding to, and the Democrats were attempting to utilize to their advantage through rhetoric. However, Holt's description diminishes the significance of the anti-Masons and the actions of grassroots National Republicans that caused the party to hold a convention. National Republican Party leaders did not plan for convention, Instead, the convention was an unintended consequence of Clay's speaking tours, opposing Jackson's policies. Chase convincingly stresses the impact of the spontaneous nominations of Clay by meetings and conventions nationwide. And this nationwide grassroots activism in support of Clay and the convention meant that, as Chase describes, the publicity given the National Convention by these men was responsible for its meeting rather than the sanction of party leaders. So, National Republican Party leaders didn't plan a convention. Grassroots political activism was only one of the pressures that led to the organization of the convention. Chase portrays the development of grassroots activism for a national convention as having occurred so rapidly that Clay and his advisors were compelled with some reluctance to bestow a tardy blessing. The emphasis Chase places on the pressure the leaders felt for grassroots members overshadows the pressure placed on the party to follow the anti-Masonic precedent. So, in describing the development of modern campaigning practices, as I'm sure you're familiar, historians have tended to exaggerate the role of Democrats at the expense of actions of other political parties. Chase considers the precedent set by both the anti-Masons and National Republicans in the context of the decision by leaders of the Democrats to hold their own convention. However, similar to Cole, Chase dismisses the significance of this precedent and the pressure it placed on Democrats by instead stressing how the concept of holding a convention had originated amongst Democrats years prior. So both Cole and Chase emphasize rhetoric diminishing the action taken by the anti-Masons and National Republicans that demonstrate an expansion of political participation. Not only were National Republican leaders forced to hold a convention, but the choice of Clay as their candidate had been confirmed and promoted even, by grassroots meetings and state conventions nationwide. The Freeman's Banner depicted Clay as a unilateral choice, emphasizing how, with one voice, we could seem utterly impossible for the convention to make choice of any other individual. The portrayal of the National Republican Convention by some historians as a facade of democracy is thereby an exaggeration of the power of party leaders. Chase depicts Clay as a National Republican candidate even prior to his official nomination, explaining, quote, if it were admitted that he was already before the people, then the National Convention would be exposed as eyewash. However, national support for Clay was evident in the Freeman's Banner emphasis of him as, quote, the father of the American system, in a poem describing him as the star of the West. A million eyes are gladly turned onto him. So Clay's nomination and the National Republican Convention were therefore both the result of grassroots action. And finally, I'm going to turn to the Democrats. So, rather unsurprisingly, as the party with the president in power, the Democrat convention was always likely to differ for the most for the preceding conventions of the anti-Masons and National Republicans. The Democratic convention occurred amidst pressure to appear just as transparent and open to expanding political participation as the preceding anti-Masonic National Republican conventions. Unlike Jackson's election in 1828, the Democrats now had to overcome an image of elitist political power circulated by their opponents. Both the National Republicans and Democrats had debated whether holding a convention was necessary to nominate their presidential candidate, but they reached differing conclusions. The National Republicans responded to the pressure of members at large to hold a convention, but the Democrats chose to hold a convention only to nominate a vice presidential candidate. Undemocratic portrayals of President Jackson were further encouraged by his increasingly estranged relationship with his vice president, John C. Calhoun, and the fractious and dysfunctional nature of his cabinet during his first term. Vice President Calhoun had become a leading proponent of nullification, of course, for his native state of South Carolina. Jackson had been aware of Calhoun's attempts as President Monroe's Secretary of War to court-martial him for his invasion of Spanish Florida in 1818 and in 1830. Jackson used this issue in an effort to marginalize his vice president. In 1832, Jackson persisted in corresponding with Calhoun over this matter. In response to Jackson's interrogatories, Calhoun responded to a letter to Jackson, 31st of May, 1832, refuting his effort, quote, to put my conduct at issue. In an attempt to establish the correctness of your own, I must tell you have greatly misconceived my character. The correspondence between the two demonstrates the deterioration of their relationship, which is magnified by the fact that in April of 1831, Van Buren resigned as Secretary of State to give Jackson the opportunity to rid himself of his dysfunctional cabinet, especially those considered allied with Calhoun. So, although all three conventions were held with the intention of unifying the party, none was so dominated and influenced by the party elite than the Democratic Convention. On May 21st, 1832, the Democratic Convention began in Baltimore. Attempting to portray party unity, delegates from 23 states attended, unimpeded by bad weather, as the National Republicans had been. Notably, in contrast to the anti-Masons and the National Republicans, the rules and procedures adopted by the Democrats were unprecedented. The two-thirds rule was adopted so as to secure a nomination. A candidate had to receive 2/3 of the convention votes. Additionally, the unit rule determined that states' entire vote would go to the candidate supported by the greatest number of delegates from within that state. Stan Haynes convincingly argues these unprecedented rules provide evidence, quote, that the political leaders of the Democratic Party were not willing to totally relinquish control of matters to the delegates. Democratic divisions clearly depict the power of party elites in nominating Van Buren. Unlike the preceding conventions, Democrats their convention originated through the actions of political elites, with the specific aim of nominating a preordained man amidst the appearance of unity and transparency. Jackson's confidants were responsible for organizing the convention in order to nominate Van Buren to replace Calhoun. Evidence of the choice of Van Buren being forced on other states is apparent in the struggle the party continued to have to unify its members following the convention and the actions of party leaders in states like Virginia. The schismatic composition of the Democratic Party is clearly apparent in how they needed Virginia to oppose the anti-Jackson sentiment concerning the nullification crisis brewing in South Carolina. So there's a lot going on here. So I'm going to conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I welcome them. So in conclusion, the disunity evident within the Democratic Party reflects how the Democratic Party convention was dominated by warring party elites concerned only with responding to the pressure for increased transparency and broad political participation through rhetoric alone. Jacksonian rhetoric was not only contemporaneously effective in gaining voters, but has also won over some historians who emphasize the role of the Democrats in establishing modern campaign practices, including conventions. Whereas the anti-Masonic and National Republican parties expanded political participation in response to grassroots pressure and action, the Democratic Party remained dominated by political elites. The anti-Masonic and National Republican conventions, therefore, demonstrate the advent of anti-Jacksonian democratization and should be recognized for advancing and embracing modern campaign practices and creating national political nominating conventions. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, well, thank you very much, Dr. Smith. We've got just almost 20 minutes here for questions, and a few have started to come in. I have all kinds of questions, of course, but I would much rather field those from the audience and pose them to you. One of the first ones to come in came from Mark Cheatham, who is asking for a bit more on kind of the impact of 1832 on future elections. And so there's, you made this connection back to 1828 very clear. And so Dr. Cheatham is kind of just asking for more kind of looking ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we know that party platforms don't come in until the 40s. So it's not about the platforms or so much how they present themselves. A lot is about the conventions. This precedent of having these conventions is a key aspect of this. Once it's started, you don't go back. And this had come after a lot of floundering of what do we do when the caucus system isn't acceptable anymore from 1824? I don't need to tell you, Mark. But yeah, that is a key aspect to this. I would also argue, and this is a controversial one, but I'm going to argue it anyway, which is the role of populist rhetoric. And that's not necessarily just from 1832, because you can trace it back to 1828. But like I was sort of emphasizing previously, the fact that Jackson is using this rhetoric from an insider political status, that is a precedent. You know, I mean, he's not openly campaigning yet. It's still not dignified, but I mean, he's, you know, the Emance Grise, the puppet master, you know, absolutely. And you can see it written all over the Boss Veto, right? This sort of populist rhetoric. So yeah, I would say campaigning tactics in terms of rhetoric and the convention are two really key ones. I could probably think of more with more time, but there's a tricky ones.
Well, thank you. We have another question from Jason Duncan. A very interesting question, especially, I suppose, given where you are presenting to us from, which is,
My
well, yeah, it's specific to your attic. No, were there models in Britain in this period that Jackson Van Buren, anti-Masons, and National Republicans might have looked to as they're kind of making conventions part of American political culture?
That's a really interesting question. I should start by saying I'm not an international historian. I'm not a comparative historian. But I would say this, and I mean, some of it you probably already know, which is, of course, this is 1832. That's the last, the National Republican, and then they turn into the Whigs by 1834. So in terms of the Whig Party, absolutely, this idea of opposing Jackson as King Andrew the First. And you see that connection with British politics, with even the name, the Whig Party, in this sort of anti-monarchy kind of way. I wouldn't be able to say in terms of third parties and that aspect. I mean, the systems are still so different. They are so different. But no, I would say that would be the key parallel there in terms of sort of ideology and party identification.
Well, I can certainly interject my questions, but again, I would urge everybody in the audience who has one to use the Q&A feature. As we wait for them to come in, though, one thing that came to my mind when you were talking about the anti-Masonic movement, which is kind of a bizarre moment in American political history, is a lot of scholars have tied it very deeply to religion and religious revivalism, you know, seeing it coming out of Burnt Over District in New York and places like that. And so I'm wondering if that might point to a connection between kind of religion and developments in American religious practice and the political democratization trend that you're tracing here. Is there a connection?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And it's something that goes beyond New York State. And in my broader work, I talk about why the anti-Masons are popular where they are. Vermont, I have a whole section of Vermont being the only state that William Wirt actually won. And what's interesting about it is that, yeah, I mean, you have a lot of anti-Masonic newspapers, they get control of state government, but the private letters as well. The breakup within churches, church communities. No one's going to this church anymore because it's connected, or you know, that sort of community, definitely. And you do see the sort of activism as well. What will lead to the second Great Awakening? Massachusetts, another state where they're very popular, and it has a lot to do with sort of traditional Puritan religious values. So yeah, there are absolutely connections with religion and the activism and the ideology even of anti-Masonry.
Sounds good. Well, I can continue to ask you questions all day. If
I could
need
actually
be.
add conspiratorial as well with anti-Masons of religion,
Yeah.
but I mean that might be edging a bit on the line.
Right. So the other thing as folks hopefully are typing up some more questions, but the other thing that's going on in 1832 that might seem more topical than we wish it was is cholera epidemic sweeping much of the United States. You can kind of trace it over time. It hits different places at different times. And I've written about this a little bit in terms of fears about getting cholera when voting. Is there any connection to conventions or kind of the grassroots activism before Election Day that you have uncovered and fears of cholera?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I, if only there had been a recognition that, getting together when you don't feel good is not a good idea. No, I mean, there were this little, very small articles, like 1831 too, about cholera and death. And I mean, even broadly on, we talk a lot about climate change today, but I mean, there was like a massive hurricane in Barbados at that time. And it's just interesting how they deal with issues, both foreign and domestic. Because of course, a lot of these Baltimore newspapers are very concerned about shipping, transportation. What's interesting about the conventions is the anti-Masons actually have to get a bigger hall. They were not necessarily anticipated to be as successful as it was. So yeah, they have to get a bigger hall, but it's not to social distance. it's just to fit everyone in. And the public was interested. Why not? You don't have cable. This was something new, and that they could engage in and watch. Journalists came along, and so yeah. But no, there's really not. I went to the convention that I got sick. There's nothing like that. Or I'm worried about interacting with others. That connection is not. We're still a generation or so away from making that connection.
Mm-hmm. My colleague John Saval, I think, is going to jump in with a question here as well.
Yes, Laura, thank you for this provocative talk. Are you making a broader argument that conventions themselves were a force for democratization? As you parse out the various parties and how that played out, obviously you're arguing that some had more elements of democracy than others. But I'm thinking about the end of the caucus system in a previous generation, and if in your study and your argument that the conventions in themselves were a milestone in American democracy.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, absolutely. The broader significance is absolutely there. Here's the thing, is that there are always, or that there were for a long time, levels of how democratic they were. In terms of, for example, the Democrats and the unit rule and the 2/3 rule. It took generations to get rid of that. These sort of aspects, it's always a question of undergoing incremental change. That always what the founders were worried about, that the mob rule of mobocracy. The concern that democracy would go too far and you end up being like the French or something like that. So when you get to this period, you see compromise, and in a way, it goes farther than, for example, the National Republicans were really prepared for at the time. Just like, oh wow, we have to have a convention because our people want it. They're telling us, and the anti-Masons have had it. We got to do it. And so the anti-Masons be a grassroots movement as well. Of course, it had leaders, but they were a grassroots movement. You do definitely see their impact on broader American democratization and that contribution that we still live with today. I just finished by noting, provocative seems to be my middle name when I talk about this topic, but it never gets boring.
Absolutely. Would the trajectory look different if we looked at state or local conventions in terms of timing, in terms of party innovation? I mean, it's clear. I think the argument is really compelling for national conventions, and I'm wondering if we look at the levels at which a lot of people would engage more directly with politics in their county or state level. Does it look similar?
It depends on which state. I mean, I did a study on South Carolina, 1832. They basically didn't really engage in the president. It was all about nullification, and that was all white planters. That was their baby. So they're sort of the least, or one of the least democratic states. Yeah, I mean, the state level has a longer history, a lot longer history, these conventions and saying, you know, I mean, Tennessee, how they put Jackson to the fore to begin with. We nominate, we support. So yeah, it absolutely has that background, but I think what's distinct about the national conventions is that they mean so much more just being national. It doesn't depend on each state's democratic progress. It's not like if it were today, you just had state elections and then it'd be impacted by voter ID laws or voter restrictions or something like that. It is everyone coming together equally represented, or at least being invited, whether they turn up or not, and having that voice. And of course, they all come from different state traditions, but they're all there, and they all sort of make that history together.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions from the audience? I don't want this to turn into a round table among us. Okay, Mark Cheatham has jumped in again with a very interesting question, which is, why do you think national conventions, nominating conventions, didn't appear in 1828? And he points out that in the famous letter that Van Buren writes in 1827, where he kind of is imagining what would become the Democratic Party, he talked about using nominating a national convention as a strategy. So it's clearly in his mind, but yet they don't do it in 28.
I think a simple answer would be they didn't really see it as necessary. This is the thing, so many historians point to that letter. Mm-hmm. It was their idea, it was their brainchild. What are you talking about, anti-Masons? Forget it. Yeah, absolutely. Van Buren's idea, but they didn't act on it. And at that point, Jackson had hence really stopped his junto, hence stopped campaigning for him for 4 years. And I think perhaps the concern was, on the one hand, unnecessary. On the other hand, does it open it up to someone else who's going to try and take it away from Jackson? When he's the only one who has this national celebrity status right now. So I think that's why they just, and you see it again in 1832. He's our man. We're not gonna question anyone else. It's him. So yeah, it's not necessarily an idea that is in Van Buren's mind for democratic purposes. And you can see that again in 1832. It's for the good of the party and the party system, and in his mind, that's Jackson.
Mm-hmm. And then himself too, of course. And
yeah, it works out well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
For him.
Yeah. You've kind of alluded to this a little bit in talking about how different conventions are going to be kind of democratized to different levels, right? That having a convention doesn't always mean the same thing. And of course, there is a very strong critique made throughout this period that conventions themselves were simply not democratic, right? And this is often presented by people from kind of disappointed factions within a party, right? They don't get the nominee they want or the platform that they want. And so they say, well, it didn't really reflect any kind of popular will. What do you make of that? Does it just depend on which one we're talking about, or is there something more to it?
I think it's putting it all in context. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like Chase would say that about Clay, mm-hmm. but he had a groundswell of support. Mm-hmm. You know, there wasn't any other challenger or someone else who other people wanted. And even with that one, you look at the vice presidential candidacy and how they got to John Sargent of Pennsylvania for the National Republican ticket. That was a complete surprise. It was to do with balancing the ticket, as it so often is, but it was a complete surprise. So yeah, I think each convention has to be looked at within its own context. how democratic they are. I mean, you can make the argument that, as many people did, the people who were unhappy when Hillary Clinton got the nomination because they supported Bernie Sanders, or the progressive wing of the Democrats who weren't happy with Joe Biden. There's always people who feel like they've been left out in the cold. And that's the job of a candidate, is if it's a clean convention, it's not something out of the Gilded Age or something from behind closed doors for cigar smoke, etc. To make sure that you bring people and unify them. And the Democrats struggled because, of course, it wasn't an open convention.
Mm-hmm.
It was preordained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's pretty clear too. I mean, the Jacksonian coalition itself had kind of evolved so much between 28 and 32 that just kind of exacerbated that problem. We have another question from Jason Duncan, which brings up the hoopla issue, which is maybe most famously associated with 1840, but asking about whether any of these early conventions that you talked about that are looking ahead to 32 had some of those kinds of hoopla festivities that we would associate with later conventions in the 19th and into the 20th century.
At the state level, not in the national, they weren't there yet. They weren't ready to organize. They were just sort of getting sticks up, as it were. So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why people bypass 1832. They think, okay, no hoopla, whoop, okay, off we go. Actually, if you look at, for example, Democrats in Pennsylvania, they are really worried because they're just like, oh my God, our president has vetoed the bus. And people are very pro-bus here. We have to change that opinion. We have to rally people, rally the base. So what they do is they have like barbecues. They have hickory poles, as we've seen before. But even with the anti-Masons, they also have barbecues in Vermont, if you can imagine that. And they have, traditional sort of New England style meetings, community get-togethers. So yeah, you see some of it, but not at the same level. I mean, there's some things that have survived, like pins with Henry Clay on and things like that, but it's not quite at that level yet. It's the same with cartoons. You don't see it in the same way necessarily.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any final questions? We're just about out of time, but if anybody had maybe one more to jump in with, we could probably sneak it in.
Laura, because you have been a student of the 1832 election, are the conventions the key innovation, or as you think more broadly about that election, what is it that you find most salient in terms of American politics then and moving forward?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, my whole thesis was on populism and democratization, and that's partly what makes it provocative. But I wouldn't have written it if I didn't believe it, and so I do stand by. Obviously, a lot in my context at the beginning, I was talking about populism, and I was very aware of the time that I was writing it, which was obviously, Trump's election and his time in office. So, I mean, I wrote a piece after January 6th of this year talking about, because some people were saying Trump should be censured. And I said, look, a censure doesn't mean anything. Jackson was said he's the only president who has been censured, and the Democrats took it away just because it bugged him. And they didn't want it, on his legacy, staining the man's legacy. Yeah, 1832 and Jackson's presidency more broadly are very salient. They're very salient in terms of the legacy that he leaves, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of presidential power, especially. And I think that really deserves a lot more recognition. Sorry, I probably went beyond the bounds of the question there. I just sort of took it and ran, but that would be my broad answer.
Well, we've got one more, and then I think we'll conclude. We have a question from our colleague Tom Cohens, who is it points to the rhetoric that we get from the anti-Masons and from the Clay folks, who saw themselves as populists trying to dismantle an entrenched office-holding elite, right? The Jacksonian kind of patronage system. He asks, should we take them at their word? Is that not the standard pose struck by those out of power trying to win elections? The Jacksonians had struck the same pose in 1828.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. The thing is, what it puts Jackson in a really difficult position in terms of the rhetoric that he uses previously. Should we take rhetoric at its own word? No, we should never take rhetoric at its own word. But there are elements. I think this is why it sort of strikes a tone with the National Republicans and the Anti-Masons. There are elements to their rhetoric that resonate because they can point to these things that Jackson does during an election year, which is, I mean, it's extremely bold. You know, I mean, Clay thinks there's no way he's going to veto the bank, and he does write that. He ignores the Supreme Court, just like trounces all over that. Oh, you know, unbelievable. I mean, and this makes a big issue in states like Maryland, states like Massachusetts. They're really concerned about the future of Native Americans, which is a really interesting dynamic. So I think it's not so much about, you know, do we take them at their word, but why does this resonate? Because I think what I find really troubling about people's analysis of 1832 is that they just look at the election results and the map and they say, you know, clear winner, Jackson, why are we talking about this? Move on. But it's so much more than that. I mean, these issues, which, yeah, I know I didn't get a chance to get into, nullification, internal improvements, Native Americans, they matter, and they matter in the lead up to the Civil War so much. So it is about that, and it's about the fact that Jackson, if you look at the state level, does lose support in places like Pennsylvania. It's not 1828. So yeah, I hope I've been convincing, and I hope you know, you include 1832 in survey classes.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're out of time, but thank you for joining us today. And be on the lookout for the next of our webinar series, which is 2 weeks from today. We're looking forward to that very much. And until then, be well, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.